You mentioned that outbreak of really potent spices was one of the reasons that you left the Scrubs, and then the kind of consequence of that being that you were put in front of the coroner's court. And I was really intrigued by that part of your book, and surprised and saddened, because I mean, it was interesting to me and James, I think, because it was this overlap of your role within the criminal justice system, and then one that we might be more familiar with in the coroner's court. But it's, you know, intended as a non-interrogatory process. And you know, you write so movingly about you felt useless and kind of worthless at the end of it, and it made me think, one, how could the cross-examination have gone so horribly wrong that you felt like that? And then also, did that in a strange way kind of give you empathy for some of the prisoners that would have also had to undergo a similar experience and be made to feel, you're right about, I think it was a woman called Shannon, and she says that the judge called her a
worthless wretch.
Exactly. And
I still see her.
And it was this parallel in the way that she had been described, the way that you had.
Well, yes. I mean, there's so many things have happened in my life I'll never forget, and I will never forget that particular time in coroner's court. And I at the end of it, yes, I felt. I can't even quite explain how awful I felt. I know that when it was over, I managed to hold it together while I was being interrogated, is the word, is it? No, cross-examined. And when I finally got out, I just literally collapsed and sobbed and thought, I can't go through that again, because I was just made to feel, I know I'm very sensitive, but I just felt completely and utterly worthless and useless. And yes, I thought, no, I can't do that again. And yes, when I met Shannon, who I still see her coming and going in prison, and she was in a mess that night, and I couldn't understand quite why. And she said the judge had called her a worthless wretch. And yeah, I do identify with them. And some of their stories are totally and utterly heartbreaking. And I thought it was 86%, but recently it's gone up to 90% of the women apparently in prison with Bronzefield are victims of some kind of abuse. And I can promise you the stories I hear are shocking. So I really feel for them. And if there was ever a reason for the second book, it was actually to try and tell their stories. And so many of these women actually thank me for writing that book, because they feel somebody's actually trying to tell their side of the story.
Yeah.
And what brought you to writing the first book?
Well, I firstly absolutely didn't want to write any book ever, but a friend of my son's is a ghostwriter, and she was visiting, never met her before, and I'd got home from a rather heavy Friday night shift at about 10 o'clock at night, and she said, "Oh, what do you do?" And I thought, oh, here we go, and I sort of told her, rather a bit exhausted, and anyway, and she said, "Oh, that you ought to write a book," sort of thing. And I thought, you've got to be joking, that there's no way on earth I'll ever write a book. But that's how it started, and I was very, very much in two minds as to whether it's one of those do you jump or don't you sort of thing. And I thought, once I commit to this, there's no turning back. And I very, very nearly said, no, I can't do it. But typical me, when one of my boys says to me, "Oh, go on, Mum, give it a go," which is what has most of my life spurred me on, I sort of thought, oh, okay, can't back down, I've got to do it now. So that's how it started.
And there's such an appetite for these type of books, because you offer people a glimpse into a world that we're not used to.
Yeah. Yes, I must say I was really surprised that people found it interesting, and hugely surprised that anybody bought it, really. Yes, and I was just so embarrassed by the whole thing. When my husband said, "Oh, look, it's on Amazon for sale," I nearly died. I thought, oh God.
Is that because it was for sale?
Yeah, I just thought, oh, I don't want to be on Amazon. It was just, I'm actually very shy. So the sort of seeing my name on a book on Amazon it's just weird. I still feel a bit cringy about it. But
and the second book, was that more? It's more focused on your time at Bronzefield. Why did you want to focus just on the Bronzefield section?
I think really the publishers thought there was a story to be told there, and I must admit, when HarperCollins said, "Oh, what about a second book?" I thought, "Oh gosh, no, we've done it. I've told my stories," and they said, "No, come on, let's have a bit more." So then I thought, yes, I do hear some very, very shocking stories in Bronzefield, and back to the fact that I wanted to tell their story, and I mean, there's one girl. One thing I find extremely upsetting still is the IPP sentences, and still to this day I meet women. I mean, I'm only working Bronzefield now. I'd probably meet men on the IPP as well if I was anywhere else, but in Bronzefield, I still meet women on IPP sentences, and I just cannot get my head around it. I really can't.
Because they were introduced for public protection.
Yeah,
and
2005 was it? 2005? And I forget when they stopped them, but as far as I know, far too many people got sentenced with an IPP sentence, and they can't get out. It's shocking. And in fact, one girl who had served, I think, 17 years after I mean, I say a relatively minor crime, but it certainly wasn't, you know, I've seen people have less for manslaughter. And when she finally got out, there was really very little support. And, you know, how people like that ever adjust to then surviving outside, I don't know. And, yeah.
And is it right you're writing a third book?
Yes. Yes. The final book. Yeah.
Definitely the final book.
Definitely the final book, yes. It's called The Final Sentence. So, in fact, my dear old husband came up with that title, thank God. So, yeah, final book.
And what does that focus on, the third book?
That book focuses on my time working in a foreign national prison, which was, funnily enough, back at Huntercombe, because Huntercombe closed in 2010 and recategorised as an adult Category C prison, and then recategorised again as a foreign national prison. And so I ended up going back to work at Huntercombe again as a foreign national prison, and that was a very, very different experience again from any of the other prisons. So I think the publisher thought that would be another story to tell, really, because it's very different.
And how do you deal with inmates that don't speak English?
With enormous difficulty. But obviously through a translation service, which is very, very time-consuming and can be very frustrating. You know, just dialing up the translations, trying to find a Vietnamese interpreter, then having this sort of three-way conversation. So it's very, very challenging.
I wonder if there are similar challenges as well when you need translators in court, and you realise, obviously, if there's medical symptoms or information that you're trying to give them that might be quite specific and you know, not within the usual vocabulary, like the difficulty and the importance of getting the specific word correct. And I know that there's been cases where that has proved deeply problematic in courts when somebody's words haven't been translated correctly.
Oh gosh, yes, yeah. It was a very different experience in the foreign national prison, and also very emotionally very draining, actually, because so many of the people I met in there were being sent back to a country that perhaps they'd never really ever lived in, and so the stress that they were carrying with them was enormous, and I couldn't do anything to change that for them. So, yeah,
like a heightened version of it sounds like a heightened version of the frustration you might feel in any other prison, which is that you can do a certain amount to help, but then they have this expanse of uncertainty on the other side.
Yeah.
I was going to ask, it's a very big question, but you've worked in these different institutions. Do you recognise that there are significant, or what are the most significant differences in the challenges that you face between working in the men's prisons and working in women's prisons?
Well, I suppose the biggest difference, the first thought, is that Bronzefield is meant to be allegedly the largest female prison in Europe, but actually I think there's 500 or so prisoners, whereas Wormwood Scrubs, 1,300 prisoners. So partly the size is very different. And I think the type of, perhaps the people I'm dealing with, because I keep referring to the fact that the women, so many of them have been through so much abuse and violence themselves, I see them so much as victims and very damaged. So I really enjoy working with them. And yet for all the years I worked in male prisons, I was told, "Ooh, don't work in a female prison. They'll eat you alive. They'll be bitchy. They'll be nasty to you. They'll think you're all posh and horrible." And so I thought they might see me as somebody they couldn't relate to. But thank God, quite the opposite. And I'd like to think, a really lovely relationship with a lot of them. Hopefully, most of them.
Yeah. You write about that really movingly in your book, about how you feel flattered and kind of grateful for the fact they do trust you and they open up to you. And one of the things I wondered when I was reading it was, given, and you give the details of some of the women that you work with, that the absolute violation of trust so many of them have gone through, lived through. I just wondered if you had a view on where that capacity to trust you comes from. I mean,
it's a hard one to answer, that, isn't it? I think I hope they realise that I really do actually care about them, and that I'm on their side. I'm not there to judge them. I'm not there to, some of them are ashamed to tell me that they're working girls and they don't want to be, but that's the only way they can survive. And I'm not going to say, "Are you?" Or I'm not there to judge them at all. But I think, I can still remember meeting one girl, the one I refer to, who's been on this IPP sentence for all those years. And when I first met her in May 2017 and she told me her story, I was the one in tears and she was comforting me. Where does that come from? Because I couldn't believe the life she'd had to live. And yet there was her saying, "Oh, don't worry, I'm used to it. I'm all right, and there's me, bloody hell, sobbing my heart out." But so I think they sort of know. I think I've been there long enough too now that most of them realise that hopefully I'm on their side.
Mm.
And you spoke about the underlying issues that lots of the women come into prison with. Are they mental health problems going through the care system, alcohol and drugs?
Yeah, all of those and more. Scratch the surface of most of their stories, and abuse in childhood, brought up in care, homeless. The homelessness is horrendous to me. I still cannot get my head around the fact that women will leave prison and they're homeless. And I see them coming back time and time again because they want a bed to sleep and they want food and they want warmth, particularly in the winter months. And I just find that massively shocking.
And it's most of the female prisoners are there on short sentences. It's been well reported in the papers about the short sentences women serve. And they come into prison and relationships with family are lost, houses lost, but they still have those underlying issues there. How does the prison system work with those women?
Well, unfortunately, if they're only in for 10 days, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, there's not much that can really happen. They just go out again. They're out and homeless and they'll come back in again. So they come in and time again. And I think it's completely and utterly ridiculous. And recently, I know there's an ongoing committee, or a justice committee review, I believe, into all aspects of women in prison and etc. And I think unless they can address the homelessness, that they'll always have a problem of women coming back into prison. If only they could be released to a safe place and given proper support and rehabilitation, that the system will and never change. And I don't know if the figure's exactly right, but I've been told it's $65,000 a year to keep a woman in Bronzefield prison on average. So that could go a long way to paying for better sort of accommodation for them when they leave prison. But within Bronzefield, if they're there long enough, they can train to do all sorts of things, which is absolutely wonderful. There's education, there's training for hairdressing and catering and all sorts of things. But the women that come in and go out within 2 or 3 weeks, it just goes round and round.
Yeah, because I know over the years I've represented a number of people on legal aid contracts, and I saw the same women coming through the court system without the help that they need. They come into court, get a short sentence, and they're back out again, and I see them again a few weeks later. And on one occasion, I can remember representing a mother and a daughter in court as co-defendants for a theft.
Right.
Mitigating for them. They both wanted to go to prison, trying to mitigate, so get them a shorter sentence. And when the judge delivered his sentence, the mother called me to the glass to speak to her, and she asked for a longer sentence. And she wanted me to address the judge and ask, could you please give them double that sentence? The judge made a comment that it wasn't an auction house, because he felt that we were bartering for a sentence. But what's the difference? How do you treat a woman on drugs coming through the prison service who receives a short sentence in terms of methadone and detoxing?
Crikey. Oh, what
No,
fascinates me now is hearing your side of that story, because I hear that too when women come in and they say they ask for a longer sentence and they're disappointed if they sometimes haven't got as long a sentence as they want. Some girls tell me that, coming to prison will save their life. I hear these things over and over again. But the women that come in for 2 or 3 weeks on all sorts of drugs, all I can do is get them stable on methadone and hope to God that when they go out, they might stay on their methadone script. But they tell me time and time again that if I'm homeless when I get out again, doctor, I will be back on drugs, and that's the fact of life.
And do you have to keep them on a high volume of methadone just in case they overdose on release?
Well, there's always that to it. But methadone's a very strange drug, and they all have the level they need, if you know what I mean. Sometimes we might not have time enough to get them onto a high enough dose to keep them stable, but they tend to know what they know will keep them from using drugs, from using heroin. But if there isn't enough, it's far from ideal.